Pressurization. Motor systems. Go. Mercury capsule. No. All pre-start pilot lights are correct. The ready light is on. On my mark. We will pick up the count at T-minus 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition.
What absolutely fascinated me about Chuck Yeager and the astronauts was that they were all in a competition that the rest of the world didn't know about, and they were the embodiment of what was the right stuff. Each one of these people did have a different personality. Chuck Yeager is the most self-confident individual I ever met. Wally Schirra was a great jokester. Gordon Cooper was a great mystery to everybody else. He wins the self-confidence medal. And Scott Carpenter was another type entirely. Scott was the astronaut who was most interested in being a visionary. He was much more of a dreamer.
When Tom Wolfe was researching his book, The Right Stuff, it was originally about the original 7 astronauts. And it had nothing to do with the Air Force or Air Force test pilots. But in doing research in the Mercury program, everything referred to Air Force test pilots who were getting killed, getting data to support the space program. When Tom did the research about the original 7 astronauts, he saw an interesting conflict. The Air Force had never been allowed to do research flying. It's that simple. We did, performance evaluation on fighters and develop weapon systems and things like this. And when the X-1 came out in the spring of '46, it was given to NASA. And Bell Aircraft Company built it, but the Air Force paid for it, and it was the Air Force's idea to develop a rocket airplane to fly above the speed of sound, or at the speed of sound, because nothing had been above about 0.82 Mach ever. Phase 2 called to take it out to 1.1 Mach, and basically you went out about 2 or 3/10 of a Mach number each flight, looked at the data, and actually from the first flight that I made in the airplane to above Mach 1 was 93 days. Bell had built a flying tail on the airplane with the jack screw and nitrogen air motors, and it let it accelerate out to about 1.07 or 1.08 Mach. The big thing that came out of the whole X-1 program was that we found out if you're going to operate in the region of speed of sound or supersonic speed, man, you got to have a flying tail. The X-1 was classified. The rest of the world had no idea. Yeah, a year later they released we'd go into Mach 1, but never how. It took the British and the French and the Soviet Union 5 years to find out that little trick. See, that opened up the universe to us.
The job of test piloting involves flying any machine that comes along that flies higher and faster. And here was a chance to fly a machine that made a quantum leap in altitude and speed.
I think it really was the President, Eisenhower, who really suggested that what they really ought to do is look towards experienced test pilots.
The test pilots in the cadre amounted to 550. These were graduates of the Navy School in Patuxent, the Air Force School at Edwards, and the Empire Test School in Great Britain. Of those 550, only 110 had the required college degree. Chuck Yeager, for instance, didn't have a college degree. He accepted that with understanding and patience, but he would have made a great spaceman.
They had to have jet experience. I think it was 1,000 jet hours. Had to be less than 40 years old, and I think about 5'10", maybe 5'11" max. And those variables, of course, eliminated a lot of other people.
We were all ordered to Washington, briefed on what it was all about, and asked if we wanted to volunteer.
Well, then at Albuquerque, they eliminated a hell of a lot more with their physicals and their mental tests. They probed every hole they could find, and as John Glenn said, they found more holes than we thought we had, and they probed every one of them. Well, we lived through that, not knowing what they were trying to do. They were trying to get a baseline, a background, a physical background, and a mental background of a person who would go into space that they couldn't really monitor completely while they're in space.
And after 3 fascinating testing sessions, 7 were chosen. We met early April in '59. We recognized something monumental was was happening, but you come together with a crew like that and you start off with a great respect for everybody in the group.
The seven of us really didn't know each other at all until that unbelievable press conference in April of 1959. I'd say that initial press conference was something we had no experience with whatsoever. Here we were major, lieutenant commander, a couple of Air Force captains.
Each one of us, I think, was a little wide-eyed at what was going on, and I'm sure each one of us tried to give better answers than anybody else did. There was constant competition.
A lot of our friends who we knew before said, "Why are these guys on the cover of Life? They haven't done a damn thing yet." And I'm sure you've heard stories like that from guys like Chuck Yeager.
You had 7 original astronauts who had done nothing. You had, professional PRs, guys that blew them out of shape. And you had Air Force guys who had no publicity at all, and many of them killing themselves.
There were many misconceptions that were fostered by the press who didn't quite understand. Best example of that is Shepard's naming of his capsule Freedom 7. Freedom pleased everybody because that's what we are, a free nation. A newspaper in Cocoa Beach printed the story of the naming and said, "Isn't that nice of Al to name his capsule Freedom 7? Freedom is good for this country, and 7 he'd used to honor the 7 Mercury astronauts." It was really named Freedom 7 because that was the 7th capsule offline. It was number 7. But that misconception was created, and so everybody who came along afterward had to name his capsule something 7. Gus was Liberty Bell 7. John was Friendship 7. I was Aurora 7, and Aurora came from my belief that this is sort of a celestial event.
After working with these engineers, I began to realize no one has ever given the engineers credit for these missions. I said, let's just make it sigma, meaning the sum of all engineering efforts.
Well, I figured I had a lot of faith in the people we were working with, and I had faith in all the hardware because we were following it very detailed, very closely, and had a lot of input into the hardware. I had faith in all the launch team and people I worked with. I had faith in myself, and I had faith in God. I named it Phase 7.
What we had to prove in Mercury was that man could go into space, do some reasonably complicated tasks, maneuver the vehicle, take it over, and bring it back home safely.
First of all, the interesting thing was nobody knew how to train an astronaut, including us. So we had to devise a training program at the same time we were training. We went to UDT school to get underwater training, but we felt that maybe somewhere along the line underwater might simulate zero gravity somewhat, and it turned out we were exactly right on that. Plus the fact we needed to know how to get along in the water because we were going to be landing in water, and Deke Slayton didn't even know how to swim.
We worked very closely with the engineers. They were buddies. They still are. That kind of loyalty was unbelievable. Well, that's what test pilots were trained to do, was work with those engineers and become team players. They called us immediately if they saw something they didn't like, and we would come together either by phone or go out and look at the product and say, we can't work with that. And it was that kind of input that took us through that beginning of the space program and made it work so well.
The identity of America's first astronaut has been kept from the public until almost the final moment. The question everyone has asked is, which one will be first?
Probably my first disappointment was when they made a selection for Shepard to have the first flight. Actually, they didn't name him at that point. They named Shepard, Grissom, and Glenn.
When Al was chosen, every one of us thought it was a terrible mistake because we were not chosen. Once the choice was made, we banded together behind Al.
All of us had been trained almost equally to that point in time. And only about the last month, they put Shepard into the high-speed training session. And Glenn was his backup. And Glenn was back up again for Grissom. And then Glenn somehow lucked out because we were supposed to have had a third suborbital flight. And they just said, let's go orbital. And John had that flight. Scott was given that second orbital flight, and I was his backup.
My mission was exactly like John's in duration, but I was given more freedom to control and to experiment and to do some science. John's flight was mainly an engineering flight, trying to evaluate the capsule and its systems. We moved on to the next flight, and I was interested in evaluating what was there before we got there rather than what got us there.
Well, my Mercury mission finally got off in October of 1962. We had to prove we could stay in orbit for 6 days. Then if we had a longer orbit, a longer mission, we could do a lot of experiments. But at that point in time, experiments were not as significant as making the spacecraft work well and perform well. And all of those things were my goal, and that's what that Sigma 7 kept me thinking about. Don't screw up this one. This has to be just right. I landed within about 3 miles of the carrier, and the carrier skipper, he was Captain Rankin at that time, and I discussed this, and I said, you know, but for your ship being 3 miles out of position, that was a pretty good recovery. And we kidded about that for years ever after. But it was really fun to come down and land where I was supposed to land within sight of the carrier. Everything worked perfectly.
So I knew probably a year before that I was going to have the Mercury 9. We had to prove that, first of all, I could totally power the spacecraft down and go for long periods of drifting flight, and prove that I'd use as little fuel as we thought we would, and we did even better than we thought. Oxygen was the big surprise, because I was the first non-smoker to fly, and based on the consumption of the guys who had flown before, I used 1/3 of the oxygen they'd planned on me using, which is pretty good testimonial for clean lungs.
If you look at the movie, 3 hours and 13 minutes long, if you look at the Air Force test pilots and people who worked in the Air Force, it was very, very accurate. And me as a technical advisor, I made sure it was. I knew nothing about NASA. In looking at the movie, they took a lot of liberties when they portrayed the NASA guys and the Mercury program and the German scientists.
One episode that was shown in the movie was our argument as a group with an engineer who spoke with a German accent. He was never identified as von Braun, but because of that accent, everybody assumed it was von Braun. We were shown arguing with him for an explosive hatch and a window, but that argument was not with von Braun because he had nothing to do with spacecraft design. He was propulsion only. It was an argument with a reticent American engineer. That's number one. Number two, nobody ever argued with von Braun because he was always right.
The capsule was rocking around a bit, but there weren't any loose items in the capsule, so I don't see how I could have hit that button. No. I was just lying there, flat on my back, and it just blew.
I really disliked the movie portraying Gus as having screwed up that way. He did not. We were kidding around, and I said, Gus, by the way, I now know that you did not inadvertently hit that hatch. I showed them a big cut in my hand. There's a plunger about the size of a silver dollar that you have to hit to actuate that hatch. And I hit it with my glove on, and with all the protection of the glove, and the recoil from that plunger cut into my hand, and the hatch was blown off into a mattress on the flight deck of the carrier, which I had prearranged. When Gus saw that cut hand, you never saw such a big smile in your life.
Wyman, Friendship 7 on UHF. You receive, over.
Roger, Friendship 7, loud and clear.
Over.
Writing that book and going out to interview people made me realize the concept of the right stuff. It means the willingness to risk death on a daily basis.
I flew 27 different types of airplanes in 1 month. You've got test pros, you're working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Air Force was losing a lot of people, but it's the only way we could get data, and that we figured it was worth it. There's no emotionalism involved. He's got a job, you do it, if you get killed, that's the way it goes.
Well, I don't think any of us ever felt like heroes and very special people. I think we all felt like we were very lucky to be in the right place at the right time. And I think we felt that we were extremely fortunate to be in this program, and we were associated with a lot of very great people.
Every profession has its right stuff. It comes in different forms, but it's not unique to spacemen.
The devotion we had and all the engineers and the technicians that worked with us around the clock, that was the right stuff.
We all got together and worked very well together, and it became a fraternity that has no equal in time or place. We were like the Musketeers. We were all for one.